And then there's the question of the women. So, for example, was there one woman who went to the tomb, as John seems to report, or were there two women, as Matthew reports, or were there more women than that, as Mark and Luke report, who went to the tomb? And then the question is, was there one angel at the tomb, or two angels at the tomb? Or was it one man at the tomb, or two men at the tomb? And each one of the Gospels tells us something different on that, right? And Wallace points out that if he gets two witnesses and they tell exactly the same story in exactly the same way, he assumes they're making something up. He assumes they've collaborated in order to cover something up. So one of the things that convinced him of the eyewitness nature of the gospel accounts was the fact that they are so different in certain ways. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So we are on our third lesson on the resurrection. So we have talked about what the resurrection is, what the New Testament means by resurrection when it talks about resurrection. We talked about how people in the first century viewed the question of resurrection, what they understood it to mean. And then last week we talked about the historical evidences for the resurrection. We talked about all the various facts that we know from history which really can only be explained by the resurrection of Jesus. So we saw just the tremendous historical basis we have for the resurrection. So that leaves us with kind of the one big main question yet to think about, which is why, when we read the four Gospels and we read the accounts of the resurrection, why do we encounter so many differences, so many different? Some people think of them as discrepancies or possibly even contradictions in the Gospel accounts of what actually happened on Easter Sunday. So that's what we want to talk about today, what really happened on Easter Sunday, and then we want to take just a few minutes at the end to think about what does that all mean. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going today. I don't have a list of resources for you today because they're basically the same as we've had the last couple of weeks, so you should have those in your notes. So anybody who has even casually read through more than one of the Gospels and read through the accounts of Easter Sunday, of Resurrection Day, anybody who's read even just two Gospels and thought at all about them notices that there are significant differences in the accounts. Okay, so Robert Funk, who's one of the co-founders of the very skeptical Jesus Seminar, he says about the resurrection accounts, he says they're just hopelessly at variance. In other words, there's no way to reconcile these accounts. They're just hopelessly at variance. And even the conservative scholar, N.T. Wright, refers to what he calls the obvious apparent surface inconsistencies. So there are these apparent inconsistencies. You should note that he calls them apparent and surface inconsistencies, but nevertheless they are there, and anybody who reads the Gospels can see them. So there are a number of them, and I just mentioned some of them here. So, for example, Matthew and Mark and Luke tell us that Joseph of Arimathea buried the body of Jesus. John tells us that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus buried the body of Jesus. So which was it? and then there's the question of the women. So, for example, was there one woman who went to the tomb, as John seems to report, or were there two women, as Matthew reports, or were there more women than that, as Mark and Luke report, who went to the tomb? And then the question is, was there one angel at the tomb, or two angels at the tomb? Or was it one man at the tomb, or two men at the tomb? And each one of the Gospels tells us something different on that, right? Did only Peter run to the tomb after the women came back and reported the tomb was empty? Luke tells us that Peter ran to the tomb. But John tells us that Peter and another disciple, possibly himself or somebody else, ran to the tomb. And then when you read through Luke, it looks like all the post-resurrection events, including the ascension, all happen on Easter Day. Okay, they all happen on that first day. If you read Luke, it looks like. On the other hand, the Matthew and John tell us that they happened over a period of a number of days. Right? Mark, if we accept what the scholars tell us about the ending of Mark, that the last 8 verses, that Mark actually ends at verse 8, and verses 9 through 16 were added later. They're not actually part of the original book of Mark, and virtually all scholars agree on that those last 9 verses aren't part of the original book of Mark. So Mark doesn't tell us anything about what happened after the women came back from the tomb. So those are some of the things that just jump out to you as you read the accounts, and anybody with a brain is going to go, well, how does this all work, right? And how important is it? Well, before we talk about the differences and think about them and think about the significance and think about whether or not they're really contradictions or that sort of thing, one of the things we need to think about first is, what do they agree on? Okay? And it turns out there's a whole lot more they agree on than there are differences. So, for example, all the Gospels agree that these events happened on the first day of the week. And they all agree that that was the third day after the crucifixion, and they all agree that these events happened very early in the morning. Some say at dawn, some say while it was still dark, but they all agree that it happened very early in the morning. They all agree that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. They all agree that other women also went to the tomb. They all agree that when the women got there, the stone was rolled away from the tomb. They all agree that there was somebody else at the tomb, okay? Whether it was one or two or angels or men, they all agree that there was somebody there, and that person who was there, or those people who were there, told them that Jesus was risen from the dead. They all agree that whoever it was, or whatever it was that was there, that they were in some kind of white or very bright, dazzling bright clothing. And again, that they all agree that whoever it was that was there, however many that there were that were there, they informed them that Jesus was risen. They all agree that the tomb was otherwise empty, that the body of Jesus was gone. Matthew and Luke and John agree that the women, having discovered the empty tomb, then went to tell the disciples about it. Mark, again, is ambiguous on that. Matthew and John agree that Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene. Luke and John agree that Peter and another disciple went to see for themselves. And then Matthew and Luke and John agree that Jesus appeared to a number of people, sometimes in groups or in individuals, on multiple occasions over a period of days. And again, on this, Mark is silent. If we agree with the scholars that Mark ends with verse 8, then Mark would be silent on that. So going back then to the differences, and you'll see why the similarity, the things they agree on, are so important here in a little bit. But going back to the differences, there are several things that we need to keep in mind when we encounter these differences. And the first thing we need to ask ourselves is it a contradiction, or is it simply a difference? And Mike Licona, he likes to use the example of the difference between the way guys tell a story and the way women tell stories, right? So we'll be sitting at the dinner table, we've got guests over for dinner, or we've gone to somebody's houses for dinner, and my wife and I start telling a story about something that's happened in the past, right? And if my wife starts telling the story, you know, she tells it all. She gives all the details. She gives all the background information, you know. So if she's telling us something about talking about something that happened in one of the children's lives, she may go back and talk about when they were born before she gets to something that happened when they were 15, you know, whatever. So I, on the other hand, tend to want to kind of cut to the chase when I'm telling the story. I don't, you know, and so she'll be telling all this, and I'll say, Mary, you don't need to tell all that. Just get to the point, you know. And I'm going to tell it the way I want to tell it, right? And we've, you know, all of us have been married. We know this experience, right? One way or another, I don't know which side of the fence you're on, but we all know this. So there's, people tell stories differently. Some people want to include more than others. So when my wife tells the story differently than I do, does that mean the thing we're talking about never happened? Obviously it doesn't. Just I have one way of telling a story, she has another way of telling a story, and they're both true, right? It's just I don't choose to include all the information that she tells. So actually the difference in the way people tell stories in the Gospels actually gives credence to them being eyewitness accounts. So for example, J. Warner Wallace, I don't know if you're familiar with him or not, but he of course is a well-known Christian apologist. He's an award-winning cold case murder investigator, so he investigates murders that happened, you know, a long time past. But of course very experienced in interviewing witnesses and that sort of thing. And he was an atheist, and he began to look at the stories of the resurrection, studying the resurrection, and one of the things that convinced him that the resurrection happened and the resurrection was true was the differences in the accounts. All right? And the reason for that is if you have two people who witness the same thing, unless they get together and collaborate on their stories, if you just separate them and put them in separate rooms and you don't let them talk to one another, they will tell the stories differently, even if they're talking about the same thing that really happened, right? And Wallace points out that if he gets two witnesses and they tell exactly the same story in exactly the same way, he assumes they're making something up. He assumes they've collaborated in order to cover something up. So one of the things that convinced him of the eyewitness nature of the gospel accounts was the fact that they are so different in certain ways. Then another thing we need to keep in mind when we think about these differences is the kind of literature that we're reading. Okay, so we've talked about this before, of course, that the Gospels are what are called Greco-Roman biography. Okay, and there are certain characteristics of Greco-Roman biography that are reflected in the Gospels. And particularly, Greco-Roman biography had certain characteristics about it, particularly in this about 300-year time frame in which the Gospels sit. And so what we need to do, we need to understand how did people in that era write biographies. One of the things they were very concerned about was telling the truth. One of the things they were very concerned about was using only eyewitness testimony. These are features of Greco-Roman biography in this time period. And so these are some of the things we need to keep in mind when we read the Gospels, but there are ways in which Greco-Roman biography is different than modern biography. So one of the things with Greco-Roman biography is that chronology was not as critical of an issue to them. Okay, what was more important to them was the story. So they would not necessarily always put things in a precise chronological order like we do today. Or of course we don't always even do that today, but we're much more concerned about chronological order when we read a biography or when we read a history today than they were then. The readers of Greco-Roman biography did not expect things to necessarily be in a very tight chronological order. The second thing about Greco-Roman biography is that you get a lot of time compression. Okay, so events that actually happened over a period of time tend to be kind of compressed and represented as happening very, very close together. And there's at least a couple reasons for that. One of them is they weren't writing on computers, right? And they didn't have stacks and reams of paper handily available so they could take up as much space as they wanted. So they needed to compress things, they needed to condense things, so oftentimes they would use time compression. Another reason they would do that is because there was a certain narrative flow that they were trying to establish. Usually when a Greco-Roman biographer was writing, he was actually trying to tell a story, communicate an idea, or to communicate certain values or whatever. And so he would compress the time of things in order to enhance the narrative flow, which brings up the next point, which is in Greco-Roman biography you get a lot of concern about the narrative flow. So in modern biography, pretty much we just want to read the person's story of their life in the order that it happened and, just get as many facts as we can. But the Greco-Roman biographers were much more concerned about the narrative, about the story, and how the story flowed. And that's one of the reasons why chronology wasn't as important. That's one of the reasons why they used time compression. And then there's, Lacona points this out, there's a difference between a photo and a portrait. So if I ask you all, what did George Washington look like? You probably have an image in your mind of what George Washington looked like, right? But none of us have seen a photograph of George Washington, right? All we've seen are portraits, right? Well, oftentimes when people read history today, what they want are photographs, right? They want a very clear, precise, exact picture. But that's not what you get in Greco-Roman biography. In Greco-Roman biography, you get more of a portrait. Now, we don't question that we know pretty much what George Washington looked like because there are enough portraits around, right? But it's not a photo, okay? And so we need to keep this in mind when we're reading Greco-Roman biography, that they're not necessarily trying to give us a photograph, they're trying to give us a portrait, okay? So these are just some of the things to keep in mind. In addition to that, other things to think about is what really is the significance of the differences. So when you encounter differences in a story, particularly in the Gospels, what is the historical significance of that, right? So even if there are some differences that don't get resolved, and I've listed a few differences here today that we're going to talk about, and hopefully it'll give you some peace of mind about them. But there are probably others that you could encounter. And there may be some that after you've thought them through as carefully as you can, you just can't get them resolved. What does that mean? Okay, what is the significance of that? And it turns out that differences that are peripheral to the story don't change the main thrust of the story. And that's why I wanted to list for you not only the differences that we talked about, but I also wanted to show you all the points, and I didn't even show you all the points, but all the points on which they agree, okay? So the question is, the differences that we encounter, how significant are they? Are they peripheral to the main point that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to a number of people? That's the main point of the story, right? How germane are these other things, these differences or these discrepancies we think of, how important are they? So for example, Lacona likes to use the example of, I was going to say Noah's Ark, the Titanic. There's a little difference there. So he likes to use the story of the Titanic. So of course, the Titanic's out there in the North Atlantic. It hits an iceberg, and it gets ready, and it's starting to sink. And so, a number, what was it, 1,200 or so survivors got into lifeboats, and so they're out there in the lifeboats, and the Titanic sinks, right? Well, when the survivors of the sinking of the Titanic were interviewed later when they got to shore, and they interviewed them, some of them said that the Titanic split in two before it sank. And some of them said, no, the Titanic sank in one piece. Okay? And it turns out that, well, when you think about it, and Lacona likes to point this out, here these people are, they're sitting out there in a lifeboat. This is the most traumatic experience any of them have ever had in their life. The only thing they can see, other than a few other lifeboats around them, is this humongous ocean liner in front of them. And they can't agree on whether it's split in half or sank intact. Okay? And it turns out that we never knew for decades whether or not it split in half or went down intact, because we had these conflicting reports of eyewitnesses, right? But for all those decades that we didn't know, was there anybody saying, well, the Titanic just never sank? Because we've got different opinions about how it sank, right? So this illustrates the importance of determining whether or not the differences are germane to the main point, whether how critical they are, how important they are to the main point, or are they simply peripheral. So finally, after many decades, of course, just a couple decades ago or so, they managed to find the Titanic, and they discovered it, and they could answer the question, right? And it's split in half. Okay. So, and then another point to think about is just the nature of the events. So think about what we're talking about. We're talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about Passover week, right? So there are in Jerusalem literally tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of extra people in Jerusalem, right? So there's all kinds of people in Jerusalem. The city is just absolutely packed. As you can imagine, talk about the birth of Jesus and no room in the inn. There was no room in Jerusalem, right? Every square space is occupied. Every living spot is used, and probably many places that weren't even really designed for living were being used for housing people. So you have all kinds of people there. In addition to that, we learn from the Gospels that there were a number of women. Matthew says many women who were there from Galilee. So these are women who have traveled with Jesus or have come down for Passover, who are there, who are followers of Jesus, a number of women who are there. We would presume, given the situation in Jerusalem at the time, that these women are housed in various locations around the city, or even as far away as Bethany and outlying areas, right? In addition to that, because there are so many women, it's reasonable to assume they were in groups. They didn't all just hang together in one big conglomerate group. There were probably groups of 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever, groups of women. And so when we think about the women coming to the tomb in Jerusalem, they're obviously getting up early in the morning from wherever they're housed, wherever they're staying, and they're traveling to the tomb. It's very likely they're coming from different locations, right? So some may have been coming from Bethany. Actually, some of the women that it talks about here, we believe, actually lived in Jerusalem. Some of them were, Mary, the wife of Clopas, was probably, had a residence in Jerusalem. Salome possibly also had a residence in Jerusalem. So they would have been coming from their homes. Other women would have been coming from other places. What this implies then is that women coming from other places would leave at different times and arrive at different times. It implies that they would have different experiences as they went to or from the tomb, right? And we're just talking about the women. We haven't even talked about the disciples, the men, right? And we haven't talked about all the other crowds. So the point is, and John Lennox points this out, is this is just a very complex situation. So when you get a number of eyewitnesses in a complex situation telling the stories of their experiences, you're going to get a lot of variation. And it's not necessarily contradiction, it's just differences, right? So let's go back then and let's think about the women, so we just kind of get a picture of what's going on. Let's go back to the crucifixion. And if we go back to the story of the crucifixion, we learn about women who are there and others who are there witnessing the crucifixion. And Matthew tells us that there were many women from Galilee. Okay, so there are a number of women from Galilee, and then he mentions 3 specifically. He mentions Mary Magdalene, he mentions Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, or Joseph, and he mentions the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Okay, so that would be Salome. Salome is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. And so he mentions three, but it's very clear they're not all the women. There are other women besides those. These are women who are at the crucifixion. And then Mark just mentions some women, okay? And then he mentions the same three that Matthew does. He mentions Mary Magdalene, he mentions Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and he mentions Salome. Luke says all the acquaintances of Jesus were there at the crucifixion. Now, as a sidelight, you've probably heard, as I've heard many times in my life, that the disciples, when Jesus was arrested, fled, and they went and they hid out, and the only one who ever showed up at the crucifixion was John, because he's the only one we hear about, right? And so I always hear that the disciples weren't there at the crucifixion. Luke tells us they were. Luke tells us all the acquaintances of the Lord were there at the crucifixion, including all the women, including the women, of course, who had come from Galilee. And then John tells us that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was there. Now, she wasn't mentioned in any of these other three, but by name she is mentioned, Mary, the mother of Jesus. And then there's Mary's sister. This again is Salome, the wife of Zebedee. And then again he mentions Mary, the wife of Clopas. Okay, so Clopas was a Jewish official from Jerusalem. She hasn't been mentioned by any of these others, but she's mentioned by name by John. And then there's Mary Magdalene. So John mentions two that the others have mentioned, but then he mentions two other by name that weren't mentioned by the others. But very clearly there were others involved. These are all people who were at the tomb. So these are women who are in Jerusalem at this particular time and followers of Jesus. Then if we go to the women at the tomb, in Matthew 28, Matthew refers to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Well, John just listed 4 Marys, right? Mary Magdalene and 3 other Marys. So who's the other Mary? We don't know, do we? Matthew, for one reason or another, didn't tell us. And he said that they came to look at the beginning of dawn, and Jesus met them and greeted them. Mark tells us that Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, and Salome came to the tomb, and they brought spices very early, and they came together and they spoke with each other. So these 3 apparently came to the tomb together. Luke tells us that the women who had come from Galilee came to the tomb. Okay, so who is that? Well, later he mentions by name Mary Magdalene, Joanna, who we've not run into, we've not heard of before, okay, and Mary, the mother of James, and other women. So he mentions 3 by name and then mentions other women plural. So according to Luke, there were at least 5 and maybe more women who came to the tomb. And they came bringing spices, and they came in the early dawn. And then John, he only tells us about Mary Magdalene. And he says Mary Magdalene came to the tomb, but she came twice. So clearly she had 2 different experiences. Her first experience coming to the tomb, and then her second experience coming to the tomb, right? He says it was early while it was still dark. And some people read that and go, wait a minute, I thought it was dawn. Well, if you've ever been up early in the morning before the sun comes up, you notice that it's very early at the beginning of dawn, as one of the others says. What happens? You see a little ray of light in the far eastern horizon, right? And it's still dark, right? It's the beginning of dawn, but it's still dark. Then she comes back and she reports to the disciples, we don't know where they laid him. So John says, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb, saw the tomb was empty, came back to tell the disciples, and told them, we don't know where they laid him. What does that imply?
More than one.
More than one. So although he only tells us about Mary Magdalene, very clearly there were others with Mary, at least one other person with him. All right? And then, of course, she returns back to the tomb later following Peter and the beloved disciple, and we don't know whether she went alone or whether she went with other women. John only tells us again about Mary Magdalene and then her encounter with Jesus. So you get the picture of just the complexity and all the women that are involved, and they're possibly coming from different places. And that different gospel writers tell us about different women. Now, there could be any number of reasons why they do that, okay? Not because they're making the story up, but because they have access to different eyewitnesses, or the sources that they're using report different eyewitnesses. But clearly, it was more than just Mary Magdalene that went to the tomb. There were at least 5. So then the question is, as we think about these differences, again, the question that we want to ask is, are they contradictions or are they differences? So let's just take the ones that we mentioned earlier. So who buried Jesus? Was it just Joseph of Arimathea, or was it also Nicodemus? So someone comes and gets the body of Jesus from Golgotha, from the area of the cross, and carries the body of Jesus to the tomb, prepares the body of Jesus for burial, and buries the body of Jesus. The first question to ask yourself is how likely it is that just one person did that. I mean, a body is a heavy thing to carry a long distance, right? And particularly if you're trying to treat it with a degree of respect and that sort of thing, right? So just right off the bat, even though Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention anybody besides Joseph of Arimathea, it's pretty likely Joseph had some help, right? It just makes sense. Now, just because they only mention one doesn't mean that only one was involved. So you go to visit somebody's house. You've never been there before. You go there for dinner, and you come to the house, and it's a very nice looking house. And you walk in the house, and you say to the homeowners, you say, "Boy, this is a really beautiful home." And they say, "Yes, we built this house 3 years ago." Do they mean that just the husband and the wife built the house? No, that's not what they mean. They mean they were responsible, they were the primary actors, but clearly there were a number of people involved in building the house. We do the same thing when we talk about a battle. We say, General Lee won this battle. Did General Lee win this battle by himself? Of course not, right? So just the fact that they only mention Joseph of Arimathea doesn't mean that Joseph of Arimathea was the only one. Then the question would be, well, why does John mention Nicodemus and the others don't? And there are at least a couple, I believe it's John Lennox points this out, that there are at least a couple of reasons why he might have mentioned Nicodemus when the others didn't. One of the reasons may have been that John had already talked about Nicodemus earlier, right? So in John 3, for God so loved the world, etc., that whole discussion between between Jesus and Nicodemus. So he's already talked about Nicodemus. So if Nicodemus was involved in the burial of Jesus, even in a lesser role, it would make sense for John to mention him, because he's already talked about him before, the other writers had. Another reason may have been that Matthew, Mark, and Luke write much earlier than John. And Nicodemus was a member of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so it's possible that they declined to include Nicodemus in the story because Nicodemus was still on the Sanhedrin at the time, and they may have not wanted to jeopardize his position on the Sanhedrin or put him in some kind of a difficult position. Whereas John is writing much later, Nicodemus could by this time been passed away. And so he would have been free to include it. So there are other, I'm not saying which one explanation is the right explanation. What I'm trying to point out is there are viable explanations that give the benefit of the doubt to the writers without saying, well, clearly these guys are clueless and they're just making the story up, right? And then the question about how many women came to the tomb and who were they. So as we saw, of course, several women went to the tomb, at least 5, and as I said, very likely from different locations. And And while they may have had different experiences, those experiences aren't necessarily or inherently contradictory. So, for example, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb twice. She clearly had two different experiences. If one gospel writer records one experience and another gospel writer records another experience happened at the second time, and another gospel writer talks about both experiences, that's not a contradiction. That's simply a difference. So each gospel writer just includes the women who were important to what he was trying to report. And again, there may have been any number of reasons for that. Perhaps the women that he mentions are the only women they know by, that particular writer knows by name were actually among them. So clearly, they knew that other women went, but they only mentioned certain ones. Well, why did they do that? Well, maybe they knew there were other women, but these are the only ones they knew. Okay, so the fact that they don't mention everyone, and John mentions ones that the others don't, doesn't mean they're lying or they're making it up. There's very easily explained reasons why you get these differences, and it's not because they're making up the whole story of the resurrection. And then, of course, we have to keep in mind that Mark's account seems truncated. So we don't know why Mark ends at Mark 16:8. We don't know why it ends there. We don't know if he actually ended it there. We don't know if he wrote more and that was lost, and then somebody later wanted to add back in to kind of finish the story or whatever. We don't know why Mark ends it at verse 8 of chapter 16. But when he does end it at verse 8, the women have just left the tomb, and it says they didn't tell anyone, or they didn't speak to anyone. And people read that and they think, oh, so the women didn't go back and tell the disciples. Well, we don't know that, because we don't have the rest of what Luke wrote, what Mark wrote, or what he might have written had he written more. We don't know. What we do know is that as they were leaving the tomb, they weren't speaking to anybody. That makes sense. If you've just gone to an empty tomb, you expected to find the body of your Lord, you don't find him there, it's empty, you're going back to the disciples, but you're going through a city in which there are now a lot of other people on the streets. You don't say anything to them about it, right? Until you get to the disciples. Now, we know they did say something eventually, because we know what happened, right? So we've got the story of what happened. So clearly at some point they told somebody. So the way I read that verse is just simply as they were leaving the tomb, returning to their homes or returning to the disciples, they weren't talking to anybody. They were just hightailing it back home or hightailing it to the disciples. Is hightailing a legitimate term to use in reference to the women? I don't know. So there are reasonable explanations for all of these differences. Then, of course, was it angels or was it men? Well, that really actually is not a problem, because all the way through the Bible, angels are oftentimes spoken of as men and oftentimes mistaken for being men. So you have that classic story in Genesis where Abraham's sitting there at his tent, and it says he sees three men approaching. But as the story unfolds, we find out those three men are, one, the pre-incarnate Christ, and two angels. Okay, but he refers to them as men, and we find this happens, of course, again and again throughout the Gospels. So angels are oftentimes described as men, sometimes mistaken for men, so often so that in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews tells us to be careful to be hospitable to people, because we don't know when we will be entertaining angels unawares, right? So we don't know. It may look like a person to us, but it may be an angel, right? So it's not surprising then that when these various people come to the tomb and have various experiences, to some of them they go, they're an angel. They're in this bright clothing and all this sort of thing. And to some of them, they're angels. And to the others, they either describe them as men or they appear to them to be men. That's just evidence, again, of eyewitness accounts. But then how many were there? Was there just one angel or two angels? Was there one man or two men? Okay. Again, this is really not a problem unless you want it to be a problem. So if somebody reports they saw an angel, does that preclude that there was more than one angel there? Unless they said there was only one angel there, then that would say there couldn't have been anybody else. But if they say they saw an angel and they talked with an angel, or they saw a young man and they talked with a young man, that doesn't preclude the possibility that there were others there and that somebody else having a different experience, they're in a different location, slightly different location, they're standing in a different place, they're looking in a different way, they actually see more than one. So just simply saying that there was one does not preclude the possibility that there was more. And this comes up again then in the story about Peter running to the tomb. So Luke tells us that upon hearing that the tomb was empty from Mary Magdalene, that Peter ran to the tomb. Okay? And people object, and they say, well, wait a minute, John said that Peter and another disciple ran to the tomb. Okay? Clearly there's a discrepancy there. Well, no, there's not. Because as it turns out, just a few verses later, after Luke tells us that Peter ran to the tomb, 12 verses later, he's talking about the conversation that Jesus is having with the two disciples on the Emmaus Road, the Emmaus disciples, right? And they're talking about all these things that happened, and Jesus says, what things that happened? And so the disciples then begin to talk to Jesus about all the things that happened, and they talk about the women coming back from the tomb and telling them the tomb was empty, and then they say, some who were with us went to the tomb. So clearly Luke himself knows that more than just Peter went to the tomb. So he only mentions Peter 12 verses earlier, but clearly when he's writing 12 verses later, he knows that more than Peter went to the tomb. Okay? So the fact that he only records Peter initially doesn't contradict what John says when John reports that Peter and someone else went. Well, then did everything happen on Easter? And you read through the Gospel of Luke and you go, oh, wait a minute, I thought there was like 40 days here. And Luke reports it all, the ascension and everything, just right away. Well, this is, again, appears to be a case of time compression. And one of the reasons we say that is because we know that Luke knew that it was more than one day. How do we know that? Because in Acts, which Luke also wrote, in Acts chapter 1, Luke says specifically these things happened over a period of 40 days. So although in the Gospel of Acts, he compresses it in order to get to the end of his story, okay? In the Gospel, or in the book of Acts, he takes more time and he describes it as things that happened over a period of 40 days. So again, Luke was well aware of that 40-day period. So we have just tremendous evidence, as we saw last week, for the resurrection, for the historical resurrection. And when we read the story in the Gospels, we over and over again we see the things that all the Gospel writers agreed on. The most important is the tomb was not empty. I mean, the tomb was empty. And Jesus appeared alive to multiple people over a period of 40 days. Okay? The resurrection happened, folks. It's history. It's real. So the question is, we've been on apologetics for a year now, so now we're going to venture into a little theology here at the end. Okay? What does it mean? Okay? And there are at least a half a dozen things that the resurrection tells us. One is that prior to his death, Jesus was quizzed as to on what authority he did the things he did. And he said, the Jews then said to him, what sign do you show us as to your authority for doing these things? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. But he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. So one of the first things the resurrection tells us is that Jesus in all the things that he did, from healing people to purging the temple, all the things that he did, and all the things that he taught, and all the things that he claimed about himself, are all validated by the resurrection. And Jesus said that before he died. Before he died, he said, when I rise from the dead, that'll be the seal of the credibility. And then the resurrection is the proof that Jesus is both Lord and Christ. So there's Peter's tremendous sermon there in Acts chapter 2. Men of Israel, listen to these words. Jesus the Nazarene, a man attested to you by God with miracles and wonders and signs, which God performed through him in your midst, just as you are witnesses. He's calling his audience to be the witnesses to the things that Jesus did. So these aren't stories they made up. These are things that his audience actually observed Jesus doing. This man, he says, delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. And then a little later he says, brethren, I may confidently say to you, regarding the patriarch David, he looked ahead and spoke of the resurrection of the Christ, that he was neither abandoned to Hades, nor did his flesh suffer decay. This Jesus God raised up again, to which we are all witnesses. Therefore, let all the house of Israel know for certain that God has made him both Lord and Christ, this Jesus whom you crucified. And then Paul picks up this same theme, that the resurrection of Christ is the proof of the lordship of Christ. He says in Romans 1, he says, Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord. And so we have here, Paul here is throwing down the gauntlet to the Roman Empire. He's throwing down the gauntlet to the Roman emperor. So the Roman emperor claims that he's the Lord. He claims to be Lord. And the Romans insist that everybody in the Roman Empire confess Caesar is Lord. And Paul says, no, Caesar is not Lord. Christ is Lord. Jesus is Lord. The resurrection is the proof that Jesus is Lord. And of course, many thousands of Christians died because they insisted, based on the resurrection, that Jesus was Lord and not Caesar. The next thing about the resurrection and this counterclaim is that we have now the inbreaking of a new kingdom. So there is now a new kingdom coming. So as we've talked about before, there's a great deal of talk and discussion about the kingdom coming and the kingdom being here and that sort of thing in the Gospels. And the resurrection is the inbreaking of that new kingdom. It's the coming of that new kingdom and the establishment of the king. Number 4, Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits of the general resurrection of the saints. So as we've talked about, resurrection is not a redefinition of death. It's not a different way of looking at death. Resurrection is the reversal of death. It's the defeat of death. So much so that Paul says, but now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. And so the resurrection is the evidence that we too are going to be raised from the dead. So in chapter 8 of Romans he says, but if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his Spirit who dwells in you. So the hope that we have is the hope not that we are going to live in some kind of ethereal spirit existence somewhere, right? The hope that we have is a physical resurrection. a restoration to life of our mortal bodies. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, they are changed bodies, they are transformed bodies, they are different in significant ways, but they have continuity with the past. And this is clearly what the Gospels and Paul teaches us. Fifth, the resurrection is the proof that God is satisfied with the offering of Christ for our sins. He who was delivered over because of our transgressions and was raised because of our justification. The resurrection is the evidence I need that God was satisfied with Christ's offering for my sin. And then, of course, the resurrection is a reaffirmation of the goodness of creation. So Peter says in his sermon there in Acts, he says, God did not abandon Jesus' physical body to decay. And he also, as we've seen, is not going to abandon our physical bodies. So we have the creation in Genesis chapter 1. We have the beautiful creation there in chapter 1 and chapter 2. And then we have the fall in which the creation is corrupted and polluted. But God is not going to be defeated. When He created the world, He created a beautiful world, He created a wonderful world. Our bodies are part of that wonderful, beautiful world, and Satan and sin has corrupted that, but God is not going to leave that alone. He is going to redeem it. He is going to restore the creation. He's not just going to throw it in the wastebasket and all of us just go off and live somewhere in some kind of disembodied spirits. That is not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that the creation was good, that God created it good, and though we have polluted it and Satan has polluted it and corrupted it, God in His power and His majesty is going to redeem it, and Jesus is the first installment of that. Jesus is the first evidence of that. So, just very quickly in summary then, the resurrection is the seal of Jesus' authority. It's God's declaration that Jesus is both Lord and Christ. It is the annunciation of a new kingdom to which we owe allegiance over all other kingdoms. It's the first fruits of the general resurrection of the saints. It's the evidence of God's satisfaction of Jesus' offering for our sins. And it is the evidence of the goodness of creation. So, the resurrection then really becomes our ultimate apologetic. Okay? Jesus says about the resurrection, He says to Thomas, remember, He says, Thomas, he sees and then he believes, and Jesus says, blessed are those who having not seen, believe. That's you and I, folks. Jesus says there's a special blessedness, there's a special happiness that comes to those who believe in the resurrection who weren't the eyewitnesses. We weren't there. And oftentimes it's easy, I know, to think, gee, if I'd been there, if I'd seen Jesus, it'd make it so much easier. Okay? Well, as we see from the life of the disciples, it wasn't all that easy, and they stumbled. But Jesus said, for those of us who have not seen, but we have all this evidence, and we have the Word of God that tells us that it happened, if we believe, He says we'll be blessed. And so this resurrection of Christ, and that it is the first fruits of our resurrection, then is the blessed hope we talked about clear back in the beginning of the year. So in the beginning of the year, we looked at 1 Peter 3, where he says, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account of the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. What is the hope that's in us? The hope that's in us is the coming resurrection. And the whole purpose of this whole year, and particularly with the culmination with our lessons on the resurrection, the hope is that we'll be in a better place to explain to people why we hope in the resurrection. Right? So, that's it. That's a year. So, any questions, comments? Great. Okay. Well, God bless you all. And